We have a renowned dean of Harvard Law School being interviewed by a renowned dean of Yale Law School. What could be better? They're here to discuss a topic of great moment, saving the news, or expanding on that just a bit, what is allowed and what is required to protect the news ecosystem. Yes, this is a real treat indeed. Although neither needs much introduction, let me welcome each of them briefly. First, I want to introduce and welcome Martha Minow. She is the 300th anniversary university professor at Harvard Law School, and she served as its dean from 2009 to 2017. She clerked for Judge David Bazelon on the DC Circuit, and then for Justice Marshall. She's written a number of books and scholarly articles, and we're delighted that she is joining us to discuss her newest book called Saving the News: Why the Constitution Calls for Government Action to Preserve Freedom of Speech, which was just published by Oxford University Press. Interviewing Professor Minow is Robert Post, the Sterling Professor of Law at Yale Law School. He was the Dean of Yale Law School for the same years, also from 2009 to 2017. He also served as a law clerk to Judge Bazelon and then to Justice Brennan. In addition to his many books and articles, Professor Post is on the board of advisors of the Global Observatory on Academic Freedom and a trustee of the Facebook Oversight Trust Board. Perhaps most importantly, he serves on the First Amendment Salon's advisory board, and we're truly grateful to him for serving in that role and for being with us tonight. Floyd, Ron, David, and I are all delighted to have you with us this evening. Thank you, and again, welcome. And now over to you, Robert.
Thank you so much, Seth, for that lovely introduction. And I want to say it is such a privilege and an honor to be here today to interview Martha, my doppelganger at Harvard. And where the occasion of this is Martha's wonderful new book, Saving the News, which I hope you can see, just published, as you said, by Oxford. It's wonderful to see Martha publishing in this area. One thing you all should realize is that thinking about our communications media and how to improve them is a family tradition for Martha. Her father, the great Newton Minow, actually writes the introduction to this book, and he concludes it with this paragraph, which I think couldn't be a better introduction to Martha. He says that the book reminds him of some words by the great Edward R. Murrow, who said about television in the early days, "This instrument can teach, it can illuminate, yes, and even it can inspire, but it can do so only," I should be doing my Edward R. Murrow imitation with the cigarette, "it can only do so to the extent that humans are determined to use it to those ends. Otherwise, it's nothing but wires and lights in a box." And then Newton Minow says, Martha is one of those determined humans, and that is why her book is so important, and nothing could be closer to the truth. So, Martha, the title of the book is Saving the News. What do we have to save it from? What are the problems that spark the writing of this book?
Well, first, it's such a delight to be here with you, Robert, my dear friend, and I'm so grateful to everyone who's made this possible and to everyone who cares about the media and the First Amendment. I'm not the first to have noticed that there's only one private industry that's mentioned in the Constitution, and it is the press. And it's not just mentioned, it's given special protections, though what those protections mean has been a bit of a mystery since the adoption of the First Amendment. I think that there actually is an overused word in our time, which is crisis. But if it fits anything, I think it fits the news industry and especially local news, but not only local news. The pandemic has accelerated a trend that was already disturbing of the downsizing of news organizations. Newspapers reduced their employment by 47% before 2018, just over a 10-year period. And the number of journalists has dropped 23% just in the last 10 years. The numbers of news outlets, newspapers, cable broadcast entities that have closed is enormous. The number of newspapers, most of all, 2,000 have closed just in the last couple of years. And in 1 month, during COVID shutdowns, more than 30,000 staff at news organizations either were laid off or furloughed. there's a particular devastation of local news, and it's partly this reduction of actual staff, but it's also, of course, exacerbated by what has become the substitute, which is the internet platforms, which have drawn the eyeballs and attention of people, drawn the advertising dollars, which explains a lot of the financial crisis. But more than that, the internet, the big platforms have created sorting capacities so that people don't even receive the same information, even in the same household, and instead get what's tailored for them based on their past interests and based on the desire to maximize engagement on those platforms. And this is at least part of the reason for the polarization politically in the country, even worse for the lack of shared reality. But it absolutely is a big part of the reason for the crisis of the news industry.
So you make a number of recommendations in this book, by my count, 11. But you proleptically say that that these are okay under the First Amendment, and you seem to imagine the First Amendment as the enemy rather than the friend of what could help the news. And so maybe you could say a few words about where the First Amendment is fitting into this book and its explication.
Oh, I thought you were going to help me with this, and I hope you will. I don't think that the First Amendment is an enemy of efforts to strengthen the news industry, except insofar as it is increasingly interpreted by some courts. So just as an example, when the Fourth Circuit, not long ago in the McManus case, struck down Maryland requirement for disclosures of campaign contributions under the compelled speech doctrine, particularly saying there was lack of narrow tailoring. This is kind of my jaw dropped. There is an aggressive interpretation of the First Amendment to interfere with information and access to information. That particular one really surprised me, since Justice Kennedy had specifically identified disclosure as one of the alternatives permitted after the court had struck down, using the First Amendment, various campaign finance regulations. So there's a way, and you've written about this and you've talked about it, there's a way in which the First Amendment, in the hands of some judges, is becoming like the new Lochner, the new substantive due process doctrine used by businesses to challenge and often successfully strike down regulations, even regulations meant to serve the public interest, even to expand the range of information that's available. So that's what worries me. And I do think in that way of interpreting the First Amendment, it is an enemy of many of the techniques that I think are necessary to help save the news.
Of course, at the end of this term, we saw the court doubling down on this very aggressive Lochnerization of the First Amendment. And so and one of the things I notice in this book is that you're so careful to craft your recommendations in ways that even an aggressive view of the First Amendment would tolerate. So maybe we should get to some of those solutions, some of the recommendations that you make. You roughly divide them into three parts. The first set of recommendations are concerned with making digital platforms more responsible as actors and more accountable to the public. The second set of recommendations are ways of preventing fraud and deception and manipulation in the internet. And the third have to do with funding news sources, both print and digital. So maybe we should take them roughly in that order in terms of the different parts. So making the digital platforms more responsible, maybe you could talk about that for a few minutes, then we'll get into the specifics of particular proposals.
Well, thanks, and that was a great summary of my rather ragtag collection of suggestions. That's great. The internet is relatively a newcomer to the world of media. And each time there's been a technological advance, there has been a challenge, often legally, certainly economically, to news and its distribution and its provision. In this instance, the internet, which really was created with the subsidy of the federal government, the internet came out of research from the Department of Defense. And indeed, Google's original algorithm was funded by an NSF, a National Science Foundation grant. So the government is, fingerprints are all over this. But in addition, quite specifically, in the early days of the internet, the Communications Decency Act was drafted to include a provision that exempted from the liabilities that attach to other actors, publishers, for defamation, for fraud, for civil liability. And I understand the reasons, and it was a good reason. It was to try to insulate fledgling, experimental, new companies in this newfangled entity called the internet, so they could get off the ground. Well, fast forward to today, some of the largest companies in the history of the planet are now enjoying this insulation, which is in effect a subsidy. They're getting a subsidy that the New York Times is not getting, that the beloved Chicago Tribune, which is now just about to die, is not getting. That's one of the examples that I have of, let's like treat them like grown-ups now. The big internet platform companies, they are not adolescents anymore. And they should be treated like the big guys, and required to be responsible. Another example is, when the internet companies directly or even indirectly take the product, the work product, the intellectual property of other creators and providers without paying for it. They should be treated like responsible human beings and pay for it. And that currently is not done. Just today, the French Competition Authority fined Google 500 million euros for not complying with a prior order that it develop a licensing arrangement with news organizations for content that is surfaced in their search results. Europe has taken a lead here. And the question is, will the First Amendment be compatible with similar efforts in the United States? And will we have the political will to engage with similar efforts? There's some other ways in which this kind of take responsibility stance could be pursued. One that I think is pretty basic is every time we click and we are deemed to have consented to terms of service agreements, those terms of service agreements that aren't read by any human being and couldn't be. Somebody calculated how many months of our lives we'd have to spend if we read, and it'd be actually years if we read all of the terms of service agreements that we click through. Not only are they not read and yet treated as consented to, they're not enforced, and the companies change their terms all the time. But their terms include some sets of standards about the reliability of what is provided, about protecting people from harm, none of which are ever enforced, none of which are ever taken seriously. So this is just basic contract law. That I think the internet service providers should be treated like responsible contract partners.
Okay, so that's a wonderful beginning. And so I hear 3 points in what you just said. One is the repeal of Section 230, which gives legal immunity to the internet for normal responsibility for communications or publications, and makes them more like distributors than like publishers of information. The second one is compensation for the use of news sources. This might be a way of redirecting income and clicks from the internet back to news, if I've understood the thrust of your recommendation. And the third is enforcing the terms of agreement. So let's take them up one at a time. So let's talk first about making the internet pay, the media platforms pay for the use of news stories. And here I want to uh, query you in light of the experience of Australia, who tried to force Facebook to reach some kind of a negotiated settlement with how much to pay news services when Facebook users shared. And my understanding of the basic economics of Facebook, and I could be wrong about this, but my crude understanding is that something upwards of 95% of the posts don't deal with a news. And in point of fact, if Facebook banned all news, it would lose almost no business. So unlike other forms of media platforms, which revolve around the republication of news, if you take a giant like Facebook, the news is really quite irrelevant to Facebook. What matters to Facebook is attention, which can then service the ads and also the sale of the data. Those are the business model fundamentals for Facebook. So when Australia forced Facebook to do this, it just said, okay, fine, we won't permit people to send around the news. And it didn't suffer in Australia. And then it went back to the table and got basically pocket change that's my understanding of it. So how would you prevent that kind of scenario for Facebook? Or when you do this, are you imagining Google is something different and Twitter is something different, or expatiate on it a little?
So those are all good questions, and I guess I'd say a couple of things. One is that initially Facebook's response was, well, then we're leaving. And actually, that didn't last long. So here's an example of Facebook learning how to grow up rather quickly, a kind of infantile response, and coming back to the table. Secondly, while I largely agree with your characterization of the business model, I think it's very fascinating that actually Facebook in particular, and Google is another example, of platforms that actually trade on their ability to connect to legacy media that have good reputations, especially in the news industry. And so while the attention is key to the business model of the internet companies, part of the attention is association with reputable entities in the news industry. And that's one reason that Apple, for example, negotiated payments and under Apple News. And that is one reason why Google actually allows people to curate respected news sources. So they're clearly finding value in this association, and they're not paying for it. And so while it may be chump change compared to their ultimate bottom line, from the vantage point of the legacy news entities, it's not chump change, it's real money, and it could make a real difference.
So, I mean, I guess just to press that is, I mean, you tend to characterize the platforms as platforms. And a different way to look at it is the different platforms have different functions. And some make the kind of trade that you're talking about, like Google could not exist if I couldn't pick up the legacy news services on a Google search. I'm guessing YouTube is different. YouTube wouldn't need ever to cite it. Twitter, I don't really know whether Twitter could work or not work. I mean, but wouldn't to craft your proposal, wouldn't you need to have an account of the different kinds of media functions that the different platforms actually serve, and whether this would provide leverage or not leverage for the kind of cross-subsidization that you have in mind?
I think it's not by accident that the French authorities are operating under the framework the EU created, calling for a negotiation over licensing. It's not by accident because nobody knows what the market is. Nobody knows how to price all of this. It's got to be a negotiated arrangement. So that I agree with. On the other hand, your idea that there are distinctive lanes for these entities, I would dispute that. I would dispute it, not the least reason being that they mutate and they evolve and they change and they resist any narrow characterization. Each of them, each of the ones that you've identified, there's a different story perhaps about small ones and ones that don't even claim to be reputable and market themselves as being not reputable. But the ones that you've named actually all compete and it competes not just for eyeballs and advertising, which they all do, but they also, wander into each other's areas. And they're constantly innovating product lines to do exactly that. And Amazon just bought satellite players from Google. There's a lot of that going on. So I think that one of the reasons that it's been so challenging for conventional legal frameworks to deal with the internet is that the companies are innovative and they change all the time. And whether they are news sources, whether they're in the news business. 4 years ago, we had the head of Facebook say, "We're not in the media. We're not journalists." Well, Mark's turned around and says, "Actually, we assert our First Amendment claims." So there's a growing up going on and a recognition that there's an evolution for each of these companies over time. Twitter is such a fascinating one. Twitter has become a major tool that the legacy news industry uses to actually generate stories. And there's a constant cross-fertilization. YouTube, you point to, YouTube actually, there are individual teenagers who create YouTube channels that have more viewers than some local newspapers. And yet to say that it's not in the news industry, not entirely true, because sometimes they'll do something that then's picked up and becomes part of a news story. I had the fascinating experience of serving for a brief period on the board of CBS, which has itself a very storied history in the news industry. And I learned that in cultivating and developing new shows, some of the developers at CBS were going to YouTubers and saying, "We saw you and you're great. We'd like to have you." And they actually, in at least 2 instances, were laughed out of the room by the YouTuber who said, "I can do much better on YouTube than I can do with CBS."
Yeah.
So there's a kind of, difficulty even distinguishing entertainment from news and advertising and influencers from news in the internet platforms, and that's deliberate.
Okay, so this raises an issue that seems to me of huge significance, which is what is news? when you say what you just said, the blurring of the lines between entertainment and news, and YouTube channels versus legacy media. And on the one hand, we have a very progressive idea of the news. It's the objective reporter who guts both sides, or understands the craft of sourcing a claim, etc. On the other hand, as you just said, we have this tendency to make anything that's distributed news. So in the First Amendment, constitutional protections tend to be crafted along the lines of we give greater protections to statements which are addressed to the public, which form part of the formation of public opinion. And we have several words to describe that. We could say the statement is about a matter of public concern, but often we just say it's a newsworthy statement, or it's about something which is newsworthy. So the news is often a kind of proleptic label for that which should concern all of us in our capacity as a public. And we have a lived life in which some statements we understand is addressed to the public, and other statements we understand is not addressed to the public. And one of the criteria by which we distinguish that is, are you talking to strangers, or are you talking only to your clients or to your parents or whatever it is? Now, a property of the internet, which you just talked about with great eloquence, is that anything you put on the internet is to everybody. So is everything on the internet newsworthy? Is everything on the internet news? And of course, that's walking into a category of First Amendment protection, which is going to cause a great deal of difficulty if we imagine it that way. And how do you categorize these communications for constitutional purposes?
Well, before I even try to answer that, let me just even make it more complicated, because who's a journalist? It is become, totally up for grabs right now. Any blogger can claim to be a journalist, and for what purposes? And is it to get privileges to get into the White House or into a political convention? It's just, that's up for grabs. And then to peek ahead at one of my later suggestions, that there be subsidies for news organizations. Who counts as a news organization? And can it include profit-making entities? And my answer would be absolutely. Again, it's the only private industry that's mentioned in the Constitution with an understanding that it's a for-profit undertaking. All of that's true, but let's be clear, this is not new. This has always been the case. From the early printers through the yellow journalists, into, that great movie broadcast news, the constant fear that whatever is the aspiration to objective and high-minded news is actually being tainted or infiltrated by entertainment or scandal or appealing to people's base instincts. It's always been true. I don't think in that sense this is a new problem. And whatever the ways we've dealt with in the past, we're going to have to muddle through, I think, in the present and in the future. I think that the one of the fascinating features about the history of media in the United States is that there was perhaps an emergence, something approaching a profession of journalism after the turn of the 20th century, really quite different than what had preceded before it. It still isn't quite a profession in the way that medicine is or law is. There's no required certification. But what emerged really was a recognition that developing some standards and some self-regulation would be in the interest of all the people trying to make a living in this enterprise called journalism. And that's where we get the norms of two sources for an asserted fact. Then we get the norms of disclosed conflicts of interest of someone who claims something is true, and similar norms. Well, that led to the golden age of journalism in America. That set of self-regulation and aspirations of presenting multiple points of view, appealing to readers who have different starting points, trying to develop some shared picture of reality before getting into opinion. And a lot of what I'm talking about is, how do we recreate something like that? And the incentives for the internet service providers and other actors in this system to at least make it possible to develop those kinds of self-regulatory norms. Of course, there will be people and groups and entities that don't care about them. But for those that do, there's something to be there's some benefit to everyone. Jonathan Rauch has a book that argues that the Enlightenment itself is in danger because the knowledge institutions and the efforts to build knowledge has really been put in doubt in recent events in this country and other countries. I agree with him. And he points to the development of these kinds of self-regulatory activities of all knowledge institutions. And you've worked so powerfully in the self-regulation of the academic institutions. That if we don't have that, then we can't build some confidence in knowledge. And at the moment, we have big players that are making it much harder for anyone trying to do that. And a lot of what I'm talking about is what are the preconditions for self-regulation?
So one of the big movers that has, knocked the golden age of journalism into a cocked hat is Fox News, of course, which is not an internet entity, which is a traditional broadcast media, extremely successful, and it's success which precisely has changed the model of journalism back into an 18th century partisan newspaper, which seems to be Fox's business model, which is tremendously successful. So a lot of people say polarization comes from the internet. I think Yochai's research at Harvard calls into question how much this is true. My own intuition is that persons come to identify and to cathect onto traditional media figures like Fox News much more than on internet figures. And that's one reason that accounts for the immense charisma of Trump, is because of The Apprentice, because people could identify with him on a weekly basis on a show. And Fox News has a similar, effect. I think the internet may be trailing Fox rather than Fox the internet.
Well, I am a student of Yochai Benkler, my colleague, who's done really amazing empirical research that shows, for example, that the disinformation, misinformation of the 2016 election has much more to do with the separation of conservative news sources, Fox being among them, from the general ecosystem of news. So there wasn't a checking function. And so that conspiracy theories on the left were shut off because they were actually in conversation with other sources, not so much in the right, where they could echo each other. And it's absolutely the case that there are more people who are affected by Fox News than any particular other internet entity like Parler or something like that. That is, of course, true. Having said that, though, I think that there are a couple of more steps of the analysis that show that the internet is not separate from the development of Fox News. And moreover, the conditions that made Fox News possible include some changes in the regulatory framework that I call into question. So let me start with that first. The end of the fairness doctrine is one of the reasons Fox News is able to pursue the business model that it does. So the fairness doctrine, a feature of the scarcity of the broadcast spectrum, it's requiring the government to come up with a public interest standard to give out licenses, actually generated the development of an idea that any entity lucky enough to have one of these scarce licenses had a duty to provide competing sides on issues of public concern. The fairness doctrine was upheld when challenged in the courts, and it ended not because of a legal question, it ended politically. And when it ended, that opened up the room for partisan radio first and then Fox News. Roger Ailes, in fact, met with Rupert Murdoch, and Murdoch had commissioned, some consultants about what I want to start a network. How do I do it? And Ailes said, "This is what you're proposing is just like the others. You're trying to get everybody's attention. Forget that. Go for half the audience." And Murdoch is reputed to have said to Ailes, "Can you make money doing that?" And Ailes said, "You can make more money doing that." And indeed, that has been the case. But here's the relationship to the internet. In many parts of the United States right now, the only news source is Fox News because there is no local newspaper. There is no local radio. There is no locally produced television. It is only Fox News. Well, that has a lot to do with the destruction of the rest of the ecosystem by the internet. So that's the connection.
Do you actually think that with the present state of the court, the fairness doctrine could be revived?
I think it's challenging. I think it is very, very challenging.
You like a good challenge, I can see.
But I actually think it's a challenge maybe worth developing. It is one reason that I've developed, though, proposals that I think would not get close to that kind of a challenge, and that instead would make it possible for those providers who want to participate in something like a fairness doctrine to do so and keep it private. You suggested that one of my proposals is to eliminate Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I'm not so sure about eliminating it. I think that making it conditional, that immunity from the liabilities that attach to other publishers, I think making it conditional on, for example, adopting a reasonable moderation practice, adhering to some basic standards of journalism ethics and integrity. If it's conditional, then we're building this world of self-regulation that I think is all to the good and would be much better, certainly, than the government getting close to saying, here's what you have to do.
So the oversight board is a kind of model for you in that?
It is. It is. I think, here's a place where Facebook is a leader and has stepped up to take more responsibility and to create a largely independent oversight board to review its decisions, initially just takedown decisions, but now, as I understand it, even decisions to keep things up, and to develop kind of case law and to not be in charge. The company saying this is bigger than us, this affects more than us, and we need help. And I think that's a self-regulatory alternative, but a wonderful example of the invention of a new governance model.
So that, of course, wouldn't help you with Fox, unfortunately, making
No,
230 conditional.
but it might help with some alternatives to Fox.
Mm-hmm.
So, I heard just very sadly a couple weeks ago, an educator from Georgia was here at Harvard at a summer program and learning about issues of inclusion and diversity in classrooms, and just said kind of mournfully, I can't teach any of this in my classroom because my students and their parents only watch Fox. And they'll think that what you're talking about is critical race theory, which is brainwashing and is the new communism. It's that background that makes it hard for a public educator to function right now. And it's the lack of alternatives in a community. I do think that the crisis for local news is even larger than the lack of alternatives. It's literally a desert. Nobody looking at the corruption in a local community. Nobody reporting on is there lead in the water. Nobody doing the basic task of journalism in a local community. And I do believe, and there's evidence to show that there's a demand for it. So the problem is, finding a way to return or rebuild the revenue streams. And there again, the internet has been the problem. And it's not just internet ads. Let's be fair. It's Craig's News. When the classified ad went online, when you could get your weather and your sports news someplace else. So the cross subsidy of the old newspaper, that's gone. So we need new models.
So in that regard, one of the proposals I think you put on the table has to do with tax exemptions and deductions and credits for local news. But you think that's seriously going to be able to rebuild a model that could give us local news? Or, given the economics of the situation?
Well, one of the interesting things about local is that it doesn't take a ton. And so there is this fascinating development just in the last 5 years or so of micro local news, block by block or local bloggers. And it doesn't take much. The infrastructure isn't huge. And even finding ways to combine philanthropic sources and subscriptions is allowing some of these local enterprises to work and to exist. So they're not going to become big conglomerates, distributing information around the world. One of my interests is how can there be the modern equivalent of what the postal subsidy was at the founding of the country, a subsidy that still exists. Two kinds of subsidies for the news industry. One is a reduced rate for mailing. The other was literally free distribution between and among the news industry, with the recognition that the sharing in the news industry would improve all of them. Well, how can we do some equivalent of that so that these micro local news entities can find each other, can share their stories, and maybe scale up? ProPublica is a wonderful example where it's a national entity, but among other things, it engages in developing, for example, a data bank so that overcharging activities by prescription medicine can be searched locally, and developing a template of a local story where there can be a local, plug in and how does it apply in Poughkeepsie. And that's a wonderful model of bridging the local and the national.
That is wonderful. So, let's come back to your point about the educator who can't teach because all they watch is Fox News. And that ties into your earlier comment of Jonathan Rauch's book on the Constitution of Knowledge and the Enlightenment itself being in danger. So one question is, why is the Enlightenment in danger? And is this a product of news? Is this a product of the internet? Is it a product of I mean, how do we begin to unravel this phenomenon? So here's one set of hypotheses, see what you think about them. The Enlightenment rests actually on forms of epistemic authority. We trust the doctor, we trust the engineer, we trust Dr. Fauci, whoever it is, who's an expert. And if you don't have expertise, you don't have an enlightenment. And the conditions of our trusting expertise have been undercut by the proliferation of various forms of populism, which are anti-expertise. Why are they anti-expertise? Well, one contributing cause to that is an internet which allows them to get all the information they think that the expert has. So when the printing press was developed, it undercut the epistemic authority of the Catholic Church, because before the invention of the printing press, you could not read the gospel by yourself. The church forbade it. You had to go through the intermediary of the priest. And when you get a printing press, then I can read the gospel for myself, and I no longer have to respect what the priest says, and I have the Reformation, and I have a century and a half of war, because the epistemic authority which holds the society together gets completely undercut. So maybe the internet is functioning that way, not because it's slanted, but because it has zero marginal information costs, and everybody thinks they're an expert now. And that can join to a politics of anti-expertise, because who the hell needs the experts now?
Well, I think there's so much truth to it, but there's more. So, look, the good news and the bad news about the internet is the same thing. It's the democratization of knowledge. That's the good news and the bad news, that we each carry in our pocket with our cell phones access to more information than the major libraries of the world through history. And each of us has it. The problem is, it's not just information that it gives us access to. It's also garbage. It's also made up things produced by bots and foreign disinformation. And one of the differences between this moment and the Gutenberg Revolution is that the printing of the Bible, there was a Bible, and that's what everybody had. Now it's who knows what you're getting. And it may be called the Bible, but who knows whether it is or not. And there's no verification. And so that's why it's the bad news. The lack of intermediaries, the lack of authentication. And I think there's a hunger for it. I think people are looking for it. I also think it's not only the internet. The internet is itself part of a larger transformation, which is globalization, the tightening of a global economy, and the erosion of cultural differences, and then the sense that people have of being dislocated and unrooted from what has made their lives meaningful, and their communities have a history and an identity. And so the internet exacerbates it and contributes to it, but it also reflects that kind of globalization. And to come back to the news industry, one of the elements that I've watched with some concern is the buying up of local news outlets and the consolidation, whether it's newspapers or radio or what have you, and it's consolidating which is the opposite of the trend that you're describing. So it's reducing the numbers of outlets. It's reducing the democratic dimensions. It's the concentrated control, and Fox News is an example of that. And is that a cause or an effect? Well, it's part of the economic response to so many forces of dislocation. But I think one thing to understand is that as private equity firms and others buy up traditional news, it's a demonstration that there is value here. There's ongoing value. These are not bankrupt entities. They may not be having the same rate of return as some other companies, but I do think now we're seeing a failure by the government to watch the market and to guard against the concentration of economic power that makes it impossible for local players to survive.
So I noticed that in the section of your book where you talk about antitrust remedies, you're very cautious in terms of what antitrust can and can't give us. So maybe you want to spend a few minutes talking about that.
Yes, so it is a wonderful Yale law grad, Lena Khan, who I think has been really one of the heralds of the new way to think about antitrust. Tim Wu, another great figure, actually one of our grads, who also has pointed to the ways in which a Chicago school of thought about antitrust law kind of hollowed out some of the foundational views of antitrust law that really reduced antitrust concerns to, well, what's the consumer price? As opposed to seeing that there are dangers from concentrated wealth and concentrated market power beyond what's the consumer price. And this call to return to these larger concerns about making markets work, making competition work, I'm all for it. It's going to take, I'm not sure, changes in the courts, as well as changes in the personnel at the Federal Trade Commission and in the White House. But it may actually require legislative change, given, and I don't know if we'll get it. But one reason I'm cautious about antitrust solutions is that the remedy typically is breakup. And even if you broke Facebook up into 5 entities, 10 entities, they would still be utterly enormous. I don't think that's going to get at the issues that we're talking about. You can use the threat of antitrust action to get a settlement and maybe have conditions of the settlement be some of the proposals that I have developed. But I just think it'd be more direct to go at these large entities through a public utility framework that recognizes they're serving a public function the same way that electricity and water, these are necessities of life. They can be held by private companies, they can make a profit, but because everybody needs them, there needs to be governmental oversight. And I just think that's more direct than to have the threat of the antitrust and then maybe you make it and maybe you don't. But the remedy is not an antitrust remedy, it's something else. That's why I come out where I do.
So Justice Thomas has famously had a recent opinion where he says maybe we ought to consider these platforms. He doesn't use the word public utilities, but public accommodation, which basically would make them into public fora, and that would make them exactly the opposite
Right.
of the editor that I think you want them to be. So is there some tension between imagining them as a public utility and imagining them as a responsible journalist would have them be?
Well, former President Trump has gone even further, and in his recent lawsuit filed last week, argues that the big platforms ought to be treated as state actors. I mean, it's kind of turning on its head what has been for a long time the conservative view about the state action doctrine. It's kind of astonishing.
This is my colleague Jed Rubenfeld's theory, which he lost in a district court.
I do know that 1,000%. And I am not in favor of viewing these entities as state actors and nor as public accommodations, though that's a closer call. One of the fascinating things about Western civilization is that we create dichotomies and then they fall apart. So we create a dichotomy between public and private. But it falls apart because sometimes we mean for the public to be the state, the government. And sometimes we mean anything outside of our bedrooms. And certainly all of commerce and walking down the street. And so which is the public? So that's some of the ambiguity you're pointing to. When we talk about public accommodation, public accommodations could be a theater or a hotel or a restaurant. They're privately held, but they're open to the public for business. And it's in that respect that the media business can be privately held, but open to the public for reading and for participating, for contributing. I don't think that turns them into state actors. I don't think that turns them into public fora. I think that they retain their own First Amendment rights as editors and as framers of platforms. And that's how I would thread the needle here.
Another way to thread that needle, Martha, might be to distinguish between the platform and the ISP. So the ISP could be a public utility, but I don't know what sense. I'm trying to make sense of imagining like Twitter as a utility.
I think that's worth thinking about. The internet itself is not a thing. It's many layers of putting together tubes and software and code and packets. And so I think actually thinking through which layers ought to be treated which way is worthwhile. And the FCC has struggled with this, particularly in pricing issues, and it's the kind of thing that we need: the expertise of government agencies with private input.
Totally. Okay, so I see we have only 5 minutes left, and I thought maybe it'd come back to the big question that you really had put on the table for us, which is the threat of the Enlightenment, to the extent to which the Enlightenment rests on news and something like objective reporting or a sense of facts, common facts. And here you made the, I think, really insightful point that this is an international phenomenon, and it's tied to the globalization of markets, in particular capital markets. And I want to tie that to the notion that polarization as we see it in the world today is very much a rural phenomenon as opposed to an urban phenomenon. And it is the cities which are benefiting from globalization on the whole. It is the hinterlands which are suffering. And it's the hinterlands which are the source of the populism and the revolt against expertise, against facts. Again, now that suggests that this is a phenomenon which is being driven by forces which are deeper, really, than the news. The news is, the destruction of the news may be a result of whatever's happening in the rural hinterlands rather than the reverse. And just ask you to think about that as a way of imagining the parameters of this problem.
I'm sure that the arrows go in both directions. But when we see, crowds in India mobilized by a tweet that says that there was a hateful act, and then people die in the midst of the crowds, I don't know whether rural or urban is a way to describe what's going on.
Right.
So it is caught up in the consequences of the internet, for sure. I do think that the rise of populism and particularly of unscrupulous leaders in countries from Poland to Venezuela to the Philippines, we've seen this playbook before at other times in human history, but it's also been aided and abetted by mass communications, as the Rwandan genocide was, as the Hitler regime was. And we're seeing that happen now. And I think it's incumbent upon us to think about what are the lessons of history.
And that is a good segue to audience questions because it gets at the urgency of the problem that Martha's wonderful book addresses. So am I turning it over to you, Seth, or to you, Ron?
So let me, I'll just jump in. Let me give just a word of instruction about how to ask a question. The easiest thing to do is in your screen menu, there's a button for participants. If you click on the participants button, you'll get a little window pop up, and there is an icon that looks like a hand. And if you click on that hand, it raises the hand and it tells us that you want us to call on you. And then Lisa will unmute. I will sort of try and do it in an orderly fashion. Lisa will unmute you and you can ask your questions. Let me just turn this on so I can see on my end if folks are doing that. So feel free to ask a question. And maybe if while we're waiting, I'll try and get us started with one. It's actually a two-part question for you, Martha, about we had a panel, I think it was the last Salon we had in person before the pandemic, which your colleague Noah Feldman came and had a conversation with Jamil Jaffer from the Knight Institute about the Knight case that they had brought against Trump about the use, whether they could block him on people on Twitter. Professor Feldman, Noah felt quite strongly that the case was wrongly decided and argued in favor of that. And it boiled down to, in essence, the notion that a platform like Facebook or Twitter was essentially the modern day equivalent of a newspaper, and it ought to enjoy the same protections. And I'm interested in your view of that, and then I have a follow-up if you'll.
Sure, but I'm going to draw Robert in this as well. You know, the Supreme Court, of course, has dismissed the case as moot once Trump was no longer in office. But as I understand it, really, the question comes down to when a public official chooses to use the platform as the means to express official statements, not personal news about the family, but official policy changes. Has it become the kind of forum where that public official cannot block individual users? And when it's put in those terms, I think it's not a hard question, and I think the lower court was correct that that is actually a choice by the public official to turn that platform into the microphone. And once the microphone is the vehicle for announcing the new Pentagon regulations about this or the new rules about that, that's not the kind of setting where individuals can be blocked.
So let me just, but on the fundamental question of whether or not the Facebooks and the Twitters of the world are essentially the modern day equivalent of a newspaper, right? That's the 21st century equivalent of a newspaper. That was sort of the thing that I don't disagree with what you just said about the correct decision in the case. And that was sort of easier, but it sort of and I should say, because this is the other part of my question, you were quite harsh about the Washington Post versus McManus decision, which you may or may not recall that I handled and argued it successfully in the
I do know. Well, that's just because you're such a good lawyer.
But to me, it raises the question that I'm asking, which is that part of the point of that case was to say that here are a bunch of newspapers, and not only the Post and the Sun, but a bunch of very small newspapers, and you bemoan the decline of local news being burdened by the state to do what was essentially a fairly burdensome disclosure job that the state was well equipped to do by itself. And one of the things that we struggled with in that case was distinguishing those newspapers from the platforms that had been the principal source of disinformation during the 2016 election, which was what motivated that statute. And so I'm interested in the question of, are newspapers and platforms more alike or more different? And that's why I was pressing you on that.
Well, that's great. And that context is really important. You know, we as lawyers always think about analogies. And one of the problems with new technologies is that they kind of defy the analogies. You know, Justice Kennedy looks at the internet as the modern streets, as the modern parks, the modern soapbox. And that seems as good an analogy as, are they the modern newspaper? And for some purposes, each of those points of reference may be true. I think that one of the ways in which the imbalance for the news providers, the smaller entities versus the big platform companies is the use of artificial intelligence. Being able to scale by using techniques to sort, even for a disclosure, is relatively easy for the platforms if they're using artificial intelligence. And most of the conventional media have not done that. They've not built those kinds of capacities. I predict that they will. And I predict that that will be one way, just the same way that we as lawyers are using it for civil discovery and so forth, that some of the costs will come down for compliance with such disclosure requirements.
I mean, it's interesting because one of the other things that we found was that, if you want to place an ad on Facebook or post something on Facebook, you don't actually have to interface with anybody at Facebook.
Never. It's done instantaneously through an auction.
And even at the Washington Post, which was the largest of the newspapers in the McManus case, if you wanted to place a political ad, you actually had to interface with a person, and they reviewed it editorially before they would publish it. And that made a big difference. That sort of automated versus, and then it was coupled with the extent to which they could micro-target the ad. And those two things seem to be pernicious in a way that were not at a normal newspaper,
right.
If you would understand it. Right. Robert, were you going to add something to that?
I was going to say your initial question about Twitter shows how we build law on an edifice of metaphors. And we debate about, and of course, one of the points Martha was making earlier is that this is a very protean genre. And We don't know what metaphors are appropriate because it's developing before our eyes. And what makes the metaphor appropriate is that it corresponds to practices and expectations that we have, and that would feel violated if they're broken. So on the Trump Twitter account, imagine that you have a president who makes an official announcement hiring a hall and makes it to an audience of people who bought tickets. And he excludes members of the general public, even though he is making announcements which are official. I mean, I take it that we wouldn't say that people have the right to go into the stadium if they hadn't bought a ticket, even if the stadium is used as the megaphone for the president to do it. So it doesn't follow from the fact that the president is using it. What it would follow from is how to understand the medium of Twitter. And that's precisely what we don't have a good understanding of, or at least I don't, because I don't use it. So I don't know how to think about it. But I certainly can see the argument either way. But the main point for us to be clear about is, as we construct it through these legal rules, so will the medium be. And I take it that's the bottom line of what Martha has been arguing in this book.
Let me see if we can get Lisa to unmute David Scover, who has a question.
Go ahead, David.
Thank you very much. Well, I just want to first say hello to my former Yale Law School colleagues. It's amazing to see the two of you together. I feel as though we've gone back, 40 some years, and I'm we're at the law journal offices. Well, let me say that to begin, I've really found this discussion extremely interesting and very, very complex. And I must disclose right up front that my approach in all of this is very much colored by the views that Ron Collins and I began to articulate publicly in our book, The Death of Discourse, where we took a quote-unquote cultural approach to the First Amendment. And so basically we looked at questions of First Amendment value, not by way of court doctrine or even high normative theory, but what is the culture demanding? What are people calling speech, etc.? And in that regard, I have to say, Martha, that there were points where I just, I thought that your comments at least stretched credulity for me. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples and just do with this what you want, respond as you wish. But I don't really see any evidence like you articulated that people are hungering, to use your words, for the gatekeepers of the traditional media. In fact, if that were true, if that actually were true, and if that hunger were really there, it seems to me that there would be greater evidence of readership for the traditional news sources that are imploding. And so I question that. And then the other point that I thought was so interesting was you're talking about micro-localism in the media. I think you're absolutely right. Local news is dying, no question about it, because of economic structure. These micro-local entities that you're talking about do thrive. I happen to have one in West Seattle where I live. It's called the West Seattle Tatler, and it deals with basically West Seattle issues. But my reaction to the idea that the micro local entity is going to be any sort of replacement for local news is that seems to belie the truth. The Tatler is a source of tremendous gossip and a great deal of what I would think is disinformation. And any real discussion of news that isn't about someone's cat in the tree or lost dog, is it just isn't to be found in these in this micro local entity. So I'm not certain that the micro local quote unquote newspaper, if you want to call it that, is really much of a substitute for the lost and imploding local and regional news.
So, David, it's such a delight to see you. And of course, I am a follower of your work and what you think about. And of course, you ask some very good and pointed questions. If I said there's a hunger for intermediaries, that's a clunky sentence and not a good one. I think there's a hunger for actually for information, certainly about local activities, about local health and safety issues, about corruption. And I also think that there is a hunger for some kind of authoritative truth. Just people find it in different places. I don't know the Tatler. I'm thinking about micro news entities that are actually block by block in my hometown of Chicago, and that really are giving voice to people who never had the chance to be journalists at the major outlets. And are covering what's going on in communities that were not really subject to the beats of the major news entities. One of the dangers is, of course, there are large and largely corporately funded interests that are disguising themselves as these micro news entities.
That's true.
And that's a bigger concern to me. And one of the reasons that I do think there does need to be some kind of government oversight and some kind of subsidy that has a set of criteria about who gets funded and who doesn't. In my own community, yes, we have it's a commercially provided platform that advertises about local lost cats and dogs. But if there was the kind of insulation from antitrust problems that the Associated Press has been able to provide for conventional news, for some of these micro entities, they could well aggregate. And I'll just give you the story that when the lead was found in the water in Flint, Michigan, there was a local news provider that actually blew the whistle, that amplified the insights from a public health courageous whistleblower. And that led to the, alterations of the government and so forth. And I met with that public health official and I said, I'm so amazed by what you did. She said, we were lucky. We had local news. And then she said, we have hundreds of Flint, Michigans in America, but we don't know about it because we don't have local news providers. And that has haunted me ever since. I have no doubt people want to know, is there lead in the water that their children are drinking?
Thank you.
Can I just make a point here, which is there is one form of authority on the internet, which is, I think, actually kind of new in humankind, which is crowdsourcing. Like Wikipedia, and it's everybody has a point of view and you aggregate the point of view, and it doesn't come from expertise, it just comes from people saying whatever they want to think. And that's one form of a micro local news that everyone just puts into the pot, and what comes out is reliable because it's crowdsourced, a la Cass Sunstein. Or it's just we're hungry for information. But another way to put that is we're hungry for accurate information. And accurate information requires expertise to vouch for it, whether it's journalistic expertise or medical or whatever else it is. So these are two different forms of what we're being offered by way of the internet. And the first one, the crowdsourcing, is rather new. And we can confuse it with news because news is information and we care about information, but it's not news in the progressive sense that develops in the 20th century. And I think it's important to keep these two things apart.
it is a wonderful point, and it's also the case that we have, not just the 20th century, but the last 3 centuries developed statistics as another form of knowledge, and this kind of aggregation and making sense of it is relatively new for human beings. Susan Silvey, who's a great sociologist, has commented that it's taken, centuries to develop practices around all kinds of social interactions. And the internet has developed so quickly. And we don't have what is, in essence, the historical experience of crowdsourcing. How do you develop traditions? How do you have norms? How do you have mores around the internet? And instead, we have, a couple large profit-oriented entities that are giving full employment, by the way, to psychologists who exploit our foibles, who exploit our cognitive mistakes, and basically feed us a diet of what makes our heads turn. And that's a case for regulation. That's like the origin of the regulatory state. There are dangers to public health, and we need to collectively respond to it.
Sorry, needed to just unmute here. I think we can go to the next question. It will be from Jess Braven. If you can turn on her mic, Lisa.
Go ahead, Jess.
Okay, sure. Can you? All right, I'm on. Hear me? So
Yes.
so how great to see some some of my favorite academic all-stars here, and my own dear con law professor. But in thinking about some of the proposals, because I do work in that legacy media that you've mentioned that we've heard of, I have trouble imagining any kind of government subsidy coming out of the current or a plausible Congress. I also see a lot of resistance within the news industry to accepting any kind of subsidy from the government because in our worldview, we are the superior of the government that keeps them in line and supervises them on behalf of their owners. And so to be on their payroll is not something that I think many journalists would feel comfortable doing. And there's whether there's an explicit or an implicit expectation of pleasing the source of your funds, I think could be very, very troublesome. Structures that allow tax subsidies and so forth for other, entities maybe is a different story. But in terms of an outright subsidy, I have trouble imagining that. But I do have another idea, which is that, you both work for some of the wealthiest institutions in our country, if not the world. And what the news industry does is not that far apart from what universities do. I mean, I remember when I first worked in a newsroom, I felt it was like being at a university on speed. I mean, you're doing what some people take years to do, you're doing it in a day or faster in order to get news out. We've seen universities operate radio stations, news radio stations in Washington, D.C. One of the major local news outlets is WAMU, which is owned by American University and does a very credible job as a primary source of local news that competes with the Washington Post and so on. The University of Maryland runs through its journalism school, a news service which has students, but also professional supervisors that covers the state capital in Annapolis and provides wire reports for small newspapers across the state that cannot afford to have their own correspondents. And I just wonder why, or if universities should begin with their great endowments, begin to think about adding this to part of their mission, because they can provide the sort of insulation from government, even though they are heavily subsidized directly and indirectly by the government, for this type of acquisition and propagation of knowledge. I wonder, maybe, for example, Johns Hopkins University recently bought the giant white elephant on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington called the Museum, building that should never have been built there, and that's a whole other issue. But if Hopkins had enough money to buy that building, they certainly had enough money to buy the Baltimore Sun. And I would wonder if maybe their mission would have been more appropriately served by providing that incredible resource to that city and to the nation, instead of just trying to expand its graduate programs for sale in Washington, D.C. So hang on, it's the Supreme Court calling. You got my question, so go ahead and CEO and answer. Hello, it's Jess.
Thank you.
Hello,
Thank you. Jess, as an avid reader of what you do, I don't think you want the government telling you what to do. I certainly would be reluctant to see that. But the kind of legislation that I've seen introduced and that I would support would not be a government agency. It would be a tax deduction to individuals who buy subscriptions. It would be a tax deduction or credit to companies that advertise, particularly in local news. And there's, legislation of that nature and would pluralize the sources. But I actually find a lot of interest in your suggestion. Nick Lemon, the former dean of journalism at Columbia, pushed very hard for journalism schools at universities to provide the front ranks of local news. And at this moment in the United States, if there is a journalist covering state houses, it is very often a student journalist. So some of that is happening and more could happen. How universities should spend their endowment is, thank goodness, a question that I never really had as part of my job and certainly do not now. But I think that knowledge institutions, including universities, including media outlets, including publishers, need to be thinking together about how to collaborate, how to cooperate. But I still think there's a role for the government, particularly on the tax and tax deduction front. There could be taxes applied to the large internet outlets with the revenues designated for some well-insulated pot of money that's distributed to journalism. And let's say it didn't support the Wall Street Journal, but it supported investigative journalism, maybe even the legal defense for investigative journalists. That would be something that could be supported. But in any case, I think that the tax and spending powers of the government can and should be deployed and do not get close to interfering with your intellectual and First Amendment freedoms. But Robert, what do you think?
I agree.
All right, well, let's move to another question. Nell Minow. That name sounds familiar to me. Lisa, if you can turn on Nell's mic, that would be great.
I've really been enjoying hearing how long everybody has known Martha. I'd like to say that I've known her the longest. And I'm curious, for all four of you, what news sources you rely on and how that has changed as you have looked at these issues.
Well, thank you, Nell Minow. My first teacher, my older sister, brilliant media critic as well as corporate critic. I am old-fashioned. I rely on the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and such Twitter sources that are sent to me by you and a few other trusted friends. Robert, what do you rely on?
I mean, I use the legacy media. I use magazines like Atlantic Monthly, etc. And recently, I would say, I do a lot of cable news. I do MSNBC, I do CNN, and I do Fox just to see what people are hearing. It's a kind of meta news. And I do now Twitter. I took over Scott Shapiro's Twitter list about 5 years ago. And, while he's expanded, I just follow these people. And I noticed that if there's a breaking news, I'll get it much quicker on Twitter than I'll get it on any cable or on any legacy news media. And I don't tweet, I just follow it passively, but it's quite interesting for me to see. I'm always confused when I see news stories about things trending on Twitter, because of course, how many people have to say something before it becomes a news story that people are talking about it in Twitter? And there's always someone willing to say something. So I've never understood Twitter as a meta news source, that things are, it's controversial on Twitter. I don't understand what that means, but it is something that is very immediate, and you do get a sense of what people are saying and thinking in a way that's not mediated by gatekeepers.
Seth, do you have news sources?
Sorry. Well, let me defer on that question, and I'm just going to go to the next question if we could, because I want to just see if we can get one or two more questions in before our time expires, if that's all right. Lisa, if you can turn on the mic for David Keating.
Yeah, thanks. I found this really interesting. I'd like to point out something and then also get your comments about these smaller outlets. It strikes me that something that could be really useful for these smaller outlets is to provide more legal protections for them and remove some of the burdens the government puts on them. Three immediately come to mind. One is anti-SLAPP laws, I think, are really useful for these micro outlets because you can shut down an outlet pretty quickly by hauling them into court. And as you all know, that's a really expensive proposition for a micro outlet. And most of them would probably just shut up or never publish again. The other thing is the Johnson Amendment. If you actually read the provisions of 501c3, that is like one of the worst written laws. The IRS has provided no guidance on it. And we have more and more journalism turning into nonprofits. And the reality is the Washington Post story on Roy Moore, if it was done by a C3, I don't know what the IRS would have done with it because it clearly cost that guy the election to the U.S. Senate seat. And that was a series of publishing of statements about a candidate that turned out to be fatal to his campaign. The third thing that we've seen is campaign finance laws have been weaponized at some of the local levels against these micro platforms. We saw this in Tennessee. We're representing a client. I work at the Institute for Free Speech right now in Colorado, where their micro publishing platform basically was fined by the local city, I think like $1,000 or something, and they tried to go after them in a different way. And then finally, in Washington State, there's a really interesting state Supreme Court case. There's a freedom of information law that only allows freedom of information to be distributed to so-called, institutional media. And there was a blogger on YouTube that apparently had broken a number of stories, but he couldn't get the same information the so-called regular press could. So interested in your comments about those four burdens.
Those are wonderful examples, and I think that's a next agenda for how to protect and enable the micro news entities to be able to proceed. And let's just be clear and not let the same benefits be taken advantage of by interest groups that are disguising themselves as micromedia. But I think that's extremely interesting, and I do know, in fact, that many law schools are now providing clinics to offer legal representation for journalists and for bloggers and others, and that's maybe an example of what Jess Braven was calling for.
Good point.
Let me see if we can if we can impose upon the two of you for just another couple of minutes. We have a couple more questions, even though we're just hitting maybe 6:28 right now. The first would be from Angie Van Lingen, if you can turn on her mic.
Go ahead, Angie.
Oh, wait. Hello?
Yep, you're on.
Oh, I'm on right now?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. So I was just going to ask you questions. Is this? I felt bad I had to actually leave the meeting, and I wanted to know if you had talking notes because I really like this discussion. And I have a background in journalism, and I talked to a lot of my mentors, part of this association called Investigative Reporters and Editors. And we often talk about production, journalistic efforts, networks. I do have a background in TV ratings also for the data analytics for the TV ads. So that's a big portion, and the cultural views on American society influenced by TV and TV shows, movies, and the changes throughout the generations. So I just was interested in what how this conference would move further along before I left, because it is actually very, very, very good. It's very important to know different angles to it, I think, because I'm in Los Angeles or close to Los Angeles. So I think the influence of media with Hollywood and how people think about movies, and there's a lot of different things about the content changing, because first it started initially with piracy and then moved later to funding, and then people complain about production and networks like the corporations, just like you had said, and also local news and the affiliates, and how most of the networks are owned by the same corporations. For example, Disney was CBS, ABC, and then into the smaller markets. So, and how the advertising works for that as well, and how journalists struggle to start to also find publications to write for, or it goes to the editors, right? And the ownership. So I was just curious about your thoughts on it. And also, because I was going to actually leave the meeting. So I was wondering if you had talking notes or what your thoughts were.
Well, thank you.
Before, just if I can jump in quickly, Martha.
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. You caught me a little off guard. I was trying to multitask at the time and I was paying attention, but I had to type something that I was going to leave.
So let me make a program announcement that may answer at least a portion of your question, and then I'll try
Sure.
to see if Martha and Robert want to add anything. These salons are recorded,
Oh,
and they will be posted shortly online on the salon's website. So which is hosted as a courtesy by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, which is sort of our page, but they are kind enough to post them. And so that should be available for you to come back to and look at in just a little bit. And I don't know if Martha or Robert, you wanted to add anything to that, but if so, feel free to, and if not, I can move to the next questioner. But you should be able to watch the portion that you missed and hear the pearls of wisdom that we've received.
oh yeah, definitely. I think that everything that has been said so far is what I view definitely helpful and very perceptive, just because of the way social media with data analytics and also the AI with the advertising and with taking people's information and figuring out what they like to read and spoon feeding the information as it pops up in a feed, which is interesting.
Thank you. I mean, one of the important lessons that I've learned in my work on this project is that technology is neutral. It can be used for any purpose. So the same data analytics that may lead to, extremist recruitment in one setting might be deployed, for example, by the Washington Post to figure out how to improve its subscription rate. That's what Marty Barron told me. It was one of the secrets to how he helped to grow the readership of the Washington Post. So I think that data analytics are here to stay, and finding ways that they can be used to support news operations that actually adhere to news standards would be a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. I did actually work previously for Nielsen television ratings, and I know that's been around since 1933, and the way the analytics have been used for consumer products as well as news or television, or it's expanded because of streaming. However, with the GDPR laws and the lack of GDPR laws in the United States, except for California, I know that there's some type of consumer protection, right? What do you think is going to be the trajectory with laws with this? Because that actually is a very important thing. I know in the EU, in some of the meetings that I've been with the United Nations in terms of migration and protecting data, or understanding the uses, especially with the pandemic, what they use for data science, data analytics, and measurement, but also protecting citizens' information, right, and privacy. What do you think that the trajectory will be with in the United States with these laws? Just an opinion. you're not on the record. I just wanted to know what you would think about, like, in terms, you said it would be here to stay, but what do you think that, especially with this information age that we live in?
Well, California has taken the lead, and I think that there will be, I mean, New York is trying to follow on data protection. Will we get a federal regime in the United States? I don't know. But the large companies are all adhering to the GDPR. And so the failures by the United States to regulate is going to cede regulatory authority over to others that are going to act, at least with regard to the large global companies.
Right. I hope so.
All right, if I can move to the last, what will be the last question, Matt Schaefer, if you can turn on Matt's mic.
Hi, thanks so much. This has been fascinating. I appreciate it. We talked a little bit about, the kind of, I don't know if death of the Enlightenment is overselling it, but, certainly the crisis in those ideas. Is the question not so much, obviously there are issues with, quote unquote, fixing the news, but is the question more fixing our minds? And in that regard, do you give much credence to, some of the more recent calls that really what we have is a crisis and a lack of civics education, as opposed to a crisis in the news? Or said differently, is the primary problem that we face first the crisis and the lack of civics education, and we see the effects of that crisis in the problems that we see in the news media today? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think we need an oppression Olympics here to find out who's more to blame or who's more suffering. There's no doubt that the decline in civics education in the United States is a major problem, and it's contributed to a host of difficulties and requires action. And it didn't happen by accident. There was an assault on civics education by right-wing conservative groups that viewed it as left-wing. There was also a squeezing out of time for civics education because of the focus on high-stakes testing on particularly math skills and some language skills. And then there was a kind of collapse of civics education because of internal fights, particularly among the social studies standard setters, who couldn't agree on the standards for history and other kinds of social studies. So 3 causes to its decline in the United States. I think the American Academy of Arts and Sciences has had a wonderful project on the issues of civics education and really developing a blueprint for improving it, as have groups like iCivics, founded by Justice O'Connor. And I think it's the real question is, do we view this as a bipartisan, nonpartisan issue? And I think we should. It's tied to the news issue. It's not separate, but saying what caused what, I don't think this is a problem that many need to join in, whatever caused what.
I think one way to think about this problem is it's not so much a failure of civics education, but of education. Education ought to be able to instruct us to discriminate between what's a bot and what's a person, what's a claim that's false and what's a claim that's true, what's a claim that's plausible versus implausible. And I think what we see now is it's a renaissance of the kind of conflict we had in this country in the 1920s with the Scopes trial. We see a resurgent Protestant evangelical ethic that says, screw you to civics education, we're a society of Jesus. And, you could tell those people that, there's 3 branches of the federal government till you're blue in the face, and it wouldn't modify the conviction. Now, the interesting thing about Protestantism in the United States is that, at least since the Civil War, it hasn't had any theology. It's been a matter of sensibility and of authenticity and of feeling. And that's the key point to the American evangelical revivals like Billy Graham, just come down, give yourself to Jesus. But it doesn't actually have a theology the way, for example, if you convert to Catholicism, you are acquiring centuries of thought about what you can do and what you can't do. There's a discipline there. American Protestantism not. And American Protestantism has gone through these waves where it thinks it owns the country and it should remake the country in its image. And we're going through one of those phases now. So if we're talking about the implications of what's going on, we're thinking of the subordination of secular facts to theological wishful thinking. And that's, seems to me, the essence of the crisis in the United States. And that's a deep crisis that I don't think can be attributed to civics education particularly, or even to the news in particular. That's deep cultural resonances in the US. We have a reservoir of this kind of thinking that breaks out every so often.
You know, we have certainly lessons to be learned during the COVID era, vaccine reluctance and doubts about the transmission of the disease that really make all of us in jeopardy. This is not just a nice to have feature of human experience. It is hard fought development of expertise and trust that allow us to live. So I do think it's not putting too fine a point on it to say it's a matter of life and death.
Well, on that sobering note, why don't we, let me just say on behalf of Ron and David and Floyd, how much we appreciate your participating with us tonight. That was a tremendous program, very interesting, very thought-provoking, and you have our deep thanks. Before we adjourn, I want to turn it to Ron, who had hoped to say a couple of words at the beginning, but was having a slight technological issue and was ultimately able to join us, but we didn't want to interrupt. And if you'll just stay with us for another couple of minutes, I'll turn it over to Ron and then we'll conclude.
Slight technological problem. I was being sucked down by the gravity of technological quicksand. So my sincere apologies to Martha and Robert and our audience. And I agree. This is precisely the kind of event that the Salons had and continue to want to host. So thank you both for participating. Before we close, I would like to say a few words in memory of someone who was both an important supporter of the Salons and in particularly of a remarkable event hosted in November of 2017 in the courtroom of the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse. The occasion, as some of you may know, because it's on the internet, on the First Amendment Salon site, was the reenactment of appellate arguments in the Masses versus Patton case on the occasion of the 100th anniversary. And this was the re-argument in the Second Circuit, which had reversed hand. And the person who secured the courtroom for us, the person who secured the judges for us, the person who made it possible that Floyd Abrams could represent the government and Kathleen Sullivan could represent the masses, the person that made all of that possible was my good friend and a friend of many of us here, Chief Judge Robert Katzman, who we lost this past June. It was my privilege to know Bob as a friend. I think anybody who knew Bob or knew of Bob knew that he was worthy in law and honorable in life. And so it is to his memory that I would like to take the liberty, if I may, to dedicate this salon. And so, if you will, join me to Bob Katzman, long may his memory live. Thank you.
Yes.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
And with that, we thank you all. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Robert. And thanks to our audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.